The seeker arrives at the threshold of awakening with expectations forged in fantasy. Popular spirituality promises liberation, bliss, the dissolution of suffering into some nebulous state of perpetual peace. Yet those who cross this threshold often report something far more unsettling, a profound emptiness where meaning once resided. The structures that organize their psychological universe collapse, and they stand in the ruins wondering whether enlightenment was meant to feel like existential bankruptcy. This phenomenon is not a modern anomaly. The medieval alchemists encoded it into their cryptic symbolism as the nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction phase, where the practitioner confronts not gold but decay. Carl Jung, excavating these symbols from their historical contexts, recognized in them a map of psychological transformation that necessarily passes through disintegration. The awakening is not the destination, but the beginning of a more demanding work, one that strips away not only illusion, but also the comforting narratives that made existence bearable. What the contemporary seeker encounters, then, is not spiritual failure, but an initiation into what depth psychology terms the dissolution of the provisional self. The ego, that organizing principle constructed from childhood traumas, cultural conditioning, and defensive adaptations, has served its function. It navigated a world of duality, separating self from other, good from evil, meaning from meaninglessness. Awakening destabilizes these categories without immediately providing replacement structures. The individual is left suspended between two states, no longer able to believe the old stories, not yet capable of generating authentic meaning from direct encounter with reality. This crisis was anticipated by those who walked the path before. The mystics spoke of the dark night of the soul. The Gnostics described the terror of recognizing oneself as a spark of the divine trapped in ignorance. The alchemists warned that the work requires dying before death, a voluntary descent into the psychological underworld. These are not metaphors for pleasant meditative states, but accurate descriptions of what occurs when the psyche undergoes genuine transformation. Meaning disappears after awakening because the awakening reveals that previous meanings were compensatory fictions, necessary for survival perhaps, but insufficient for truth. To understand why awakening precipitates a crisis of meaning, one must first comprehend the architecture of meaning itself. Depth psychology, particularly in its Jungian lineage, proposes that meaning is not discovered in the external world, but generated through the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. The ego does not create meaning autonomously. Rather, meaning emerges from the dialogue between the conscious self and the deeper strata of the psyche, the personal unconscious with its repressed contents, and the collective unconscious with its archetypal patterns. Before awakening, this dialogue typically operates unconsciously. The individual projects internal dynamics onto external objects and relationships. A career becomes the container for one's need for significance. A romantic partner carries the projection of the anima or animus, those contrasexual archetypes that represent unlived aspects of the self. Political ideologies provide frameworks that organize moral chaos into comprehensible narratives. These projections are not deliberately constructed. They arise spontaneously from the psyche's need to externalize what it cannot yet integrate. This mechanism is what Jung termed the projection-making factor, the psyche's tendency to cast its own unconscious contents onto the screen of the external world. Before awakening, this process generates a sense of meaning because the individual experiences their life as participating in something larger than themselves. They are working toward a goal, fighting for a cause, loving another person. The fact that these meanings are partially illusory does not diminish their psychological efficacy. They function. Awakening disrupts this machinery, whether through meditation, psychedelic experience, spontaneous breakthrough, or prolonged psychological crisis. The individual glimpses a perspective from which all constructions appear as constructions. The veil of projection momentarily lifts. One sees that the career was never about the work itself, but about compensating for a childhood wound. The beloved was a screen onto which one projected the unlived self. The political cause was a displacement of an internal war between conflicting aspects of the psyche. This recognition is what Eastern traditions call the realization of emptiness, not a nihilistic void, but the direct perception that phenomena lack inherent, independent existence. They arise conditionally, temporarily, dependent on causes and circumstances. Psychologically translated, this means recognizing that meaning is not a property of objects or situations, but a function of the psyche's relationship to them. The promotion does not contain significance. Consciousness projects significance onto it. The alchemical tradition encoded this insight differently, but arrived at the same essential understanding. The prima materia, the base matter that the alchemist works with, represents the raw psychological material before it has been shaped by projections and interpretations. It is chaotic, undifferentiated, and without inherent meaning. The alchemical work consists of separating, separatio, purifying, purificatio, and recombining, conjunctio, these elements, not to discover pre-existing meaning, but to consciously participate in meaning's creation. Here lies the crucial distinction that resolves the paradox. Meaning does not disappear after awakening because it never existed in the form the ego imagined it. What disappears is unconscious meaning, the automatic, compulsive generation of significance through projection. This feels like the death of meaning because the ego has known no other kind. It has always outsourced the work of meaning-making to unconscious mechanisms. What remains possible after this collapse is conscious meaning, significance generated through deliberate relationship with the psyche's depths. This is what Jung called individuation, the process by which the ego learns to relate to the self, that organizing center of the psyche that transcends but includes the ego. Individuation does not promise perpetual bliss or the elimination of suffering. It offers something more modest and more profound, the possibility of authentic existence, life lived in conscious dialogue with one's own depths, rather than in reaction to unconscious compulsions. The alchemists symbolized this mature relationship as the philosopher's stone, not an external substance but an internal achievement, the capacity to transmute the base matter of raw experience into psychological gold. This transmutation is not a permanent state, but a continual practice, a way of being that must be renewed in each moment. The stone is simultaneously the goal and the method, the end and the means. It represents consciousness that has integrated its own creative role in the generation of meaning. The psychological journey through the crisis of meaning follows patterns that recur across traditions and historical periods. These are not arbitrary stages imposed by theory, but phenomenological descriptions of what individuals consistently report when undergoing deep transformation. The alchemical opus, with its sequence of operations, provides one such map. Depth psychology offers another. Both describe the same territory from different vantages. The calcination, burning away the false. The process begins with calcinatio, the heating and reduction of matter to ash. Psychologically, this represents the exposure of the ego to experiences that challenge its defensive structures. The awakening itself often functions as a calcination event, a sudden recognition that shatters the ego's presumed solidity. What was believed to be the self is revealed as a construct, a collection of identifications, beliefs, and habits, rather than a unified essence. This stage is characterized by anxiety, disorientation, and resistance. The ego perceives the dissolution of its structures as an existential threat, and in a sense it is. The provisional self, the identity that has navigated the world until this point, must die for something more authentic to emerge. But death, even psychological death, activates primitive survival responses. The individual may attempt to retreat into old patterns, to re-establish the familiar meanings that provided comfort, even if they were ultimately insufficient. The calcination cannot be rushed or bypassed. Attempting to move prematurely to integration or reconstruction results in spiritual bypassing, the use of spiritual concepts to avoid genuine psychological work. The ash must be acknowledged, the false must be burned away completely. This requires what the mystics called surrender, not a passive resignation, but an active willing of one's own transformation, even when the outcome remains uncertain. The dissolution, entering the waters of the unconscious. Following calcination comes solutio, the dissolution of the calcined remains in water. Alchemically, this represents the mixing of solid matter with liquid, creating a new state of fluidity. Psychologically, it corresponds to the ego's descent into the unconscious, where rigid structures dissolve into emotional and imaginal currents. This is the phase where the absence of meaning becomes most acute. The old certainties have been burned away, and the individual now floats in an ocean of possibilities without a fixed reference point. Dreams become vivid and disturbing. Emotions that were previously repressed surge into consciousness. The boundaries between self and other, between inner and outer, become permeable and unstable. Many seekers mistake this dissolution for regression or pathology. They fear they are losing their sanity when, in fact, they are losing their insanity, the neurotic adaptations that passed for normalcy. The ego naturally resists this loss of control, this submersion in waters it cannot master. Yet the dissolution is necessary. It is in this fluid state that unconscious contents can surface and be examined. Jung emphasized that the unconscious is not merely a repository of repressed personal material, but also contains the collective patterns, the archetypes, that structure human experience across cultures and eras. During the dissolution, these archetypal forces may emerge with particular intensity. The seeker may encounter inner figures, the wise old man, the great mother, the shadow, the trickster. These are not fantasies but autonomous complexes, aspects of the psyche that possess their own intentionality and energy. The separation, distinguishing the valuable from the worthless. The third operation, separatio, involves discriminating between what must be retained and what must be discarded. The unconscious delivers its contents without discrimination. Everything surfaces, both the gold and the dross. The conscious ego must now perform the delicate work of separation, determining which unconscious contents to integrate and which to release. This requires what the alchemists called philosophical judgment, a form of discernment that transcends both naive acceptance and defensive rejection. Not every impulse from the unconscious should be enacted. Not every archetypal pattern serves the individual's development. The seeker must learn to relate to the unconscious with respect but not submission, to listen without being overwhelmed. Here the crisis of meaning takes on a different character. It is no longer simply emptiness, but complexity. The individual now possesses too many potential meanings, too many possible interpretations of their experience. The unconscious offers numerous narratives, multiple archetypal patterns through which to understand oneself. Which pattern is true? Which meaning is authentic? The answer, depth psychology suggests, is that authenticity does not lie in selecting the correct pattern, but in consciously engaging the process of selection itself. The ego that participates in this discrimination, that wrestles with the question of meaning, rather than accepting pre-packaged answers, develops a new relationship to the psyche. It becomes a partner in dialogue rather than a passive recipient of unconscious directives or a defensive controller of threatening material. The conjunction, the union of opposites. The fourth major operation, conjunctio, represents the union of separated elements, particularly the reconciliation of opposites. Psychologically, this is the integration of contents and perspectives that the ego previously held as incompatible. The light and the shadow, the masculine and the feminine, the spiritual and the material, the individual and the collective, these polarities must be brought into conscious relationship. This is not a synthesis that eliminates difference, but a holding of tension that allows both poles to coexist. Jung termed this capacity the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to generate a third position that includes but transcends the opposites. It is here that conscious meaning begins to re-emerge, not as the restoration of old certainties, but as something entirely new, meaning that arises from the integration of what was previously fragmented. The conjunction is often experienced as profound moments of recognition or insight, but these peak experiences are not themselves the goal. The goal is the stable capacity to maintain the integration in ordinary life. This requires what the alchemists called continuous circulation, the repeated working and reworking of the material. Integration is not a single event, but a practice that must be sustained. The rubedo, the reddening and the emergence of the philosophical gold. The final stage, rubedo, represents the full incarnation of the integrated self in lived reality. The philosophical gold, conscious meaning, is not an abstract achievement, but something embodied, enacted, and expressed in the world. The individual who completes this stage does not transcend ordinary life but inhabits it more fully, relating to daily existence with awareness of its deeper dimensions. This is the stage where the crisis of meaning resolves, though not through a return to naive certainty. The individual now generates meaning consciously through relationship with the self, that deeper organizing center of the psyche. Actions are no longer performed to fill an inner void or to satisfy unconscious compulsions, but as expressions of integrated wholeness. Work becomes work, not a substitute for significance. Relationships become relationships, freed from the burden of carrying projections. Yet even this resolution is not permanent. The alchemical work is circular, not linear. Each level of integration reveals new depths to be explored, new opposites to be reconciled. The journey of individuation continues until death, and perhaps, as some traditions suggest, beyond. Within this transformative journey exists a particular phase so treacherous that many never emerge from it intact. The encounter with what depth psychology identifies as the abyss of meaninglessness. This is not the productive emptiness of the dissolution phase, but something more profound and more dangerous. The direct confrontation with the possibility that existence itself is absurd, that consciousness is a cosmic accident, that all efforts toward meaning are elaborate self-deceptions constructed to avoid the terror of a fundamentally indifferent universe. The mystics knew this territory well. St. John of the Cross described it as the dark night of the soul, a state in which God's presence completely withdraws, leaving the seeker in a void darker than mere absence, a void that actively negates. The Buddhist tradition speaks of the realm of hungry ghosts, beings tormented by insatiable craving that no object can satisfy. The alchemists represented it as the mortificatio, the death stage where the practitioner must remain conscious while experiencing complete annihilation. This crisis is not a symptom of failed practice, but often its direct result. The seeker who has successfully deconstructed ego-based meanings, who has seen through the projections and identifications that previously structured existence, now faces the terrifying question: if those meanings were illusory, what guarantees that any new meaning will be less illusory? The awakening has revealed the constructed nature of significance, but it has not yet established a stable ground for authentic meaning-making. The psychological dynamics at this stage are particularly treacherous. The ego, having lost its familiar defenses, becomes vulnerable to what Jung called inflation and deflation, oscillating between grandiose spiritual identifications and crushing experiences of worthlessness. One moment the seeker believes they have achieved ultimate understanding. The next, they despair that they have understood nothing, that the entire journey was a narcissistic delusion. Depression frequently accompanies this phase, but it is not the clinical depression of neurochemical imbalance. It is what existential psychologists term ontological depression, despair arising from confrontation with the fundamental conditions of existence rather than from personal trauma or circumstance. The individual grieves not for a particular loss, but for the loss of innocence, the death of the fantasy that meaning exists independently of consciousness's creative participation. Many seekers become trapped here, caught between worlds. They can no longer return to unconscious meaning-making. The projections have been permanently disrupted, but they have not yet developed the capacity for conscious meaning generation. This liminal state can persist for months or years, characterized by a kind of existential exhaustion, a fatigue that arises not from activity, but from the continuous effort of existing without intrinsic purpose. The danger of this phase lies in its temptation toward premature closure. The psyche, desperate for relief from the unbearable tension of meaninglessness, may grasp at available narratives, spiritual ideologies, political movements, psychological theories that promise to resolve the crisis through belief. But these are typically regressions disguised as progress, returns to unconscious meaning-making wearing new costumes. Depth psychology suggests that the only authentic passage through this abyss requires something paradoxical, the willingness to remain in the tension without resolving it prematurely. This is what the alchemists meant by the massa confusa, the chaotic state that must be endured before clarity emerges organically. The seeker must develop the capacity to tolerate not knowing, to exist in the question without demanding an answer. This tolerance is itself a psychological achievement of the highest order. It requires strength not to act, courage not to believe, discipline not to escape into distraction. The individual learns to sit with the abyss, to examine it without being consumed by it, to question it without expecting resolution. In this questioning itself, something shifts. The abyss does not disappear, but the relationship to it transforms. What emerges from this sustained encounter is often described as a kind of amor fati, a love of fate, not optimistic acceptance, but a deeper recognition that meaning and meaninglessness are not opposites to be chosen between, but complementary aspects of existence to be integrated. Life does not need to possess inherent meaning for it to be worthy of engaged participation. The absence of cosmic purpose does not negate the possibility of personal purpose consciously constructed. This realization does not arrive as dramatic insight, but as gradual embodiment. The seeker discovers, almost without noticing, that they are once again finding significance in small things, not because these things are cosmically important, but because consciousness has reclaimed its creative authority. What emerges from this ordeal is not the ego that began the journey, nor is it some transcendent state beyond ordinary human experience. It is what Jung termed the individuated self, a consciousness that has integrated both personal and archetypal dimensions, that can relate to the unconscious without being overwhelmed by it, that generates meaning through conscious participation rather than unconscious projection. This individuated state possesses several characteristics that distinguish it from both the pre-awakening condition and the crisis of meaninglessness. First, there exists a fundamental acceptance of paradox. The individuated self no longer requires reality to conform to binary logic. It can hold that existence is simultaneously meaningful and meaningless, that the self is both created and creating, that freedom and determinism coexist. This is not intellectual contradiction but lived paradox, the ability to inhabit multiple perspectives without being fragmented by them. Second, projection has been largely withdrawn. The individuated person encounters others and situations more directly, less filtered through unconscious expectations and compensatory needs. Relationships become more authentic because they are no longer required to fulfill archetypal functions. Work becomes more satisfying because it is chosen consciously rather than compulsively pursued as compensation for inner emptiness. Third, and perhaps most significantly, meaning becomes a verb rather than a noun. The individuated self does not possess meaning as a static achievement, but participates in meaning-making as an ongoing practice. Each situation, each encounter, each moment becomes an opportunity for conscious engagement with the question of significance. This is not the burden it might appear to the ego that craves certainty. It is liberation into creative participation with existence. This state is not characterized by perpetual bliss or the absence of suffering. The individuated person still experiences pain, loss, confusion, and doubt. But these experiences occur within a different context. They are no longer threats to a fragile ego structure, but phenomena to be met with awareness and integration. Suffering is not denied or transcended, but consciously related to, its meaning constructed through engagement rather than passively endured or frantically avoided. The alchemical gold, then, is precisely this capacity, the ability to consciously transmute experience into meaning. Not to find pre-existing meaning hidden in events, but to recognize one's own role as co-creator of significance. The stone that transforms lead into gold is consciousness itself, awakened to its own creative authority. This understanding brings with it a particular kind of responsibility. If meaning is not discovered but created, then the individual must accept accountability for the meanings they generate. One cannot blame circumstances, other people, or cosmic injustice for the significance or insignificance of one's life. The individuated self authors its own existence, knowing that this authorship occurs within constraints and conditions, but is nonetheless real. Yet this responsibility is not experienced as burden, but as dignity. The human being, in this view, is neither a puppet of fate nor a cosmic accident awaiting external validation, but a conscious participant in the universe's unfolding, generating significance through engaged awareness. The meaning that disappeared after awakening returns, but it returns transformed, no longer a possession to be defended, but a practice to be lived, no longer a discovered truth, but a created art. The gold you seek was never in the crucible, but in the will that kindled the flame, and the courage to remain burning until the dross of illusion becomes the luminous residue of integrated truth.